Hello everyone, welcome to the Whiteboard discussion. Today we're going to talk about threat actors, or cyber threat actors if you prefer, and of their motivations, the things that drive them. This is one part of a longer series on attribution, an important and key part of threat intelligence, cyber threat intelligence, however you want to call it, and cybersecurity as a whole. Whether you work in a SOC as an analyst, or you work as a threat researcher, or you're a threat intelligence analyst, or any position in cybersecurity, you deal with attribution. And part of attribution is understanding threat actors. It's part of our taxonomy of what we consider a threat, how we describe hazards, how we describe attacks, and the things that are part of them. And their motivations are a key part that we answer on a regular basis, because knowing how and why are key things that we talk about in threat intelligence and cybersecurity. Knowing how a threat actor does something is just as important as knowing why they did something. So we're going to talk about these things today, and it comes to mind that it's very much impossible to talk about threat actors without talking a minute about attribution. Attribution, if you have not heard me say this so far, is very political. And I mean that in every sense of the word. Very much so. It is driven heavily by opinion, and it is very, very fuzzy and soft. There are some hard portions, some data points that you can use to measure and understand attribution, but for the most part, the labeling, the naming, the how, the process that we come up with and perform attribution is very much this, and is very much these things. And I'll explain why. Let me erase this and get some room. Get this out of the way here, because all you have to do is look at the naming of threat actors to begin to understand this. In our industry of cybersecurity and threat intelligence, the naming of threat actors has gone overboard. It is this complex, labyrinthine, which I'm not even going to try to spell, I'm just going to say maze-like mix of information that people try to apply to either be the first, be unique, be memorable, and so on. These drive the naming more than anything else. In fact, you might easily say that it's fair to understand that marketing, in our industry especially, has taken over the naming and discussion points of threat intelligence data and threat actors especially. They drive that more than anything else. And that's not a negative thing necessarily. Marketing is critical inside of any kind of company. Without a strong marketing department, no company sustains itself over time. You might get lucky for a little bit, you might live in the moment, but without marketing to sustain your brand, to get your message to an audience and do so consistently and help them understand when you are making changes, you will not live long term as a company. Therefore, some marketing is always awesome. The problem is when marketing takes over, when marketing drives everything, when marketing drives the data you provide, the technical organization of the data you provide, and basically overrides the technical expertise and the sensibility of how and when you should apply things. Does it become a problem and drive into the political side of the house? Because then it's, what can I sell? What can I sell? How can I sell it? More so than how can I inform? How can I educate? How can I prevent? Which are things we do are key elements of our industry. So I'm not here to ding on marketing, because again, marketing is incredibly important. It's just when it becomes overboard that it becomes too political, and that the technical and sensibility side of things drives down. And so this is why we end up with the bizarre and long and weird kind of naming conventions we have, instead of sensible things like, I don't know, threat group number, right? We have no defined, unified taxonomy to describe things. It's literally random, or it's, a zoo. We got the zoo, or we have apartments. If you take out those, that's helpful. And then you just have different ways, from whether you're using a taxi system and you're stuck to their breakdown, you've got something that's MITRE influenced, you've got something that's coming out of DOD or Department of State, and man, it just goes on. Nobody can agree on what the unified taxonomy should be. And again, marketing has a lot to do with that. Marketing and just ego, both these things really pour into the naming convention. And a naming convention causes problems when you don't have something unified. Think about if this was, a scientific endeavor, and cybersecurity is scientific, but it's also artistic, and this is part of, unfortunately, the artistic side of it. But if we were a pure science, this would be maddening, not having a unified taxonomy. Like, how would quantum physics work without some kind of unified language in which to speak in? We actually all speak to each other in little bitty niche languages and jargon and things like that, and hope that each other understands. And the greater culture around us has no clue many times what we're trying to say. That's why I'm kind of against not having a unified taxonomy. Which is why today, and when I describe things personally, I like to use Occam's razor. The law of parsimony makes sense to me, and I break things into personally organized and disorganized attackers. And if you're reading this, you can see already why the marketing engine hates it, because those are not sexy terms. They're not attractive. They're potentially difficult to understand. Most people who are like, well, I kind of get organized, I kind of get disorganized, but they're not sexy. They're not great names, not like a zoo name or like an apartment complex name or nation state or something, or an element name or whatever you might be using. They're not as cool. They're too normal, but they're very realistic. Again, Occam's razor rules. That's an apostrophe. If you're not familiar with it, take a look. I'll put a link to Occam's razor because it is one of the key things that we use as analysts. You should always look at things and not multiply them, and not make them more complicated than they need to be, i.e. the simplest answer is often the right answer. There's a million ways to define Occam's razor, but that's some of the best definitions. And so if you look at things at a simplistic level, everything, no matter how soever named, by whatever fun name the industry has given it, can be set in the organized, disorganized buckets. And because of that, you can help define motivations by understanding the organized and disorganized attackers. Now, there's a lot of elements to a profile. I'm not going to try to cover them right now. What I am going to cover is opportunity. And I see you can't see that, so let me fix this. Opportunity. So this is opportunity. And the second one I'm going to talk about is risk. These are two things that drive motivation more than anything else. There are other elements, like I said, but we're only going to talk about two of them. And you can put on a sliding scale how much an organized attacker is driven by opportunity and how much they're driven by the risk inherent in whatever they're choosing to do. And if you look at that in a scale of 0 to 100, you will see that an organized attacker tends to fall within the 30 to 50% of the time. Sometimes they'll go even farther down towards 0 because they're less driven by opportunity than they are by planning. That's the whole point of them being organized. And organized attacker, if it isn't evident, plans. They have a playbook. They have a standardization to what they do. Right? They have goals and objectives that they're more likely than not to stick to no matter what opportunity they come across. They're not going to come across an opportunity and just necessarily seize on it because they're going to stay on target. And they're not just necessarily going to innovate right on the spot. They have a playbook. They're going to stick to it more often than not. And when they don't, they fall into that opportunistic zone. But most of the time, I'd say at least 70% of the time, wow, that was a terrible 70%. 70% of the time or so, they're easily in their organized bucket and staying there, staying with the plan, staying with the playbook, following their standardization, keeping their goals in mind, no matter what they come across. Versus a disorganized attacker who has very low to no planning. They have some playbooks, but they don't necessarily use them all the time, or are they consistent with their use, right? They're very inconsistent and ad hoc in their approach. They're very chaotic. They have goals, but they're not unified goals. They may have an organization of 10 or more people, but 8 of them may have different goals, and 2 of them might align a little bit. They have a very disorganized approach. Doesn't mean they're any less dangerous, because we're not talking about hazard or danger level here, just approach. And this defines to a certain extent, behavior and motivation. Now let's talk risk. Risk has the same kind of sliding scale, and risk follows the same kind of metric. By the way, this should have been here. Organized attackers, by their organization and planning, inherently accept less risk, and so they too are down in these zones. Disorganized attackers are opposite. They accept a lot more risk. And when I speak to risk, I mean in all cycles, all portion of the operation phase, operational cycle, life cycle of an attack, from planning to recon, to build, to operate, through the actual attack, and then the monetization cycle, and then back to here. Organized attackers accept very little risk in these cycles. They accept very little risk in their planning. When they plan to succeed, they plan for all possible things. They have a backup and possibly a backup to, and a backup, depending on who they are, to whatever they're trying to do. Same thing, the reconnaissance. The reconnaissance may be low risk. By being organized, they may accept more risk at times, but when they do the reconnaissance, they'll be quiet, they'll be passive, they'll be hard to see. You won't necessarily see them just brute forcing their way on the edges until it's appropriate. And when they build, when they put things together infrastructure-wise, when they build phishing kits, when they build ways that they're going to have operational relay boxes, how they're going to move forward, how they're going to take care of infrastructure, before, during, and after the attack, what they do, how they disassemble it, how they do cleanup, all that kind of starts here in the build phase, and their operational part is the same. This part is building, putting it in place, planning, setting it up. Here they actually start utilizing it, and here they perform the attack. Here there's probably, with organized attackers, where they accept the least amount of risk, and then finally the monetization phase, or if you will, how they capitalize on what was stolen or what they just did, they accept low risk. What would that necessarily look like? Well, for an organized attacker, in the monetization phase, they may have done all these things and accepted varying levels of risk, but here, let's say they have a nucleus of data, some hot data, if you will, that they need to move, and they know its monetary value. They have a list of buyers that they normally talk to. If someone who accepts no risk or very low risk will not necessarily sell or talk to anybody outside of their known list. Someone who accepts greater risk may reach out and they may interact with new people. They may make an open offer. These are things that contain much higher levels of risk versus staying within a selective group or having people that you know are trusted, that you've verified. That's more organized. Disorganized is the opposite, especially in monetization. They will be open. They're the ones you see on CryptBB, raid forums, and all those locations where you see sales for initial access or sales of after data or transactions of databases, transactions of emails that were stolen or credit cards that were stolen, etc. Very much more disorganized, very much open, very much higher risk versus keeping a small select group or going to an investment group that will invest in you and then buy things from you to capitalize on it separately. And if you haven't figured out, criminal enterprise is exactly that, a business, an enterprise. It is loosely coupled, but it is an enterprise definitely. And this may be different than the tax life cycles you've seen before, but essentially this is a way to encapsulate the full life cycle of what's going on. If you look at MITRE ATT&CK, this matches up to MITRE ATT&CK. They just do a lesser good job, I guess. They don't do as well of understanding this part of the cycle. They have great depiction here. They have no depiction on monetization that I can figure out, but they have a little bit of understanding on reconnaissance, but they miss in the MITRE ATT&CK breakdown at least these key phases of building and planning. And they're very hard to see, so it's not an unusual thing. So back to this. I bring these two up because in organization and disorganization of attackers, all the names you can think of, from the elemental names to the zoos to the apartment complexes and so on, they all fit in these two buckets. And they can all be defined on how opportunistic and how risk adverse or accepting they are. And those are key things that influence the motivations that will drive these. And it's a key thing here to talk about that something that I consider a fumble in our industry is that people are very not aware that in previous analysis of victimology and determining motivations for like serial killers and previous crime and so forth, that I guess criminology would be what I'm referring to here, criminology, that they don't necessarily, as analysts, separate what has been ascribed to an individual versus what is on a group. Because remember, when we talk about threat actors, 9 times out of 10 we mean a threat actor group. And you cannot ascribe things that people have talked about serial killers and other victimology references and criminology references on regular crime to digital crime without making sure that you're doing a apple-to-apple kind of match. Don't take things that talk about, an individual, like sex is a big motivation for an individual. It is very little motivation when you come across a group. Groups can be driven by that particular motive, but it's unusual that it affects a group equally enough that you can ascribe it to the group as a motivator for that group. So when I'm talking about organized and disorganized attackers, I'm talking about them as a group more so than I'm talking about them as an individual. Typically, we'll say this profile and we'll talk about motivations, and then you can bring in things that are talked about with an individual. It's something that you need to be aware of, and it's a common fumble I see when people are trying to match previous work with digital cybercrime. That's why you have to be careful. Now, one thing, to move on to motivations, one thing we can all agree is that money, or finance, however you wanted to say it, drives attackers, whether they're organized or disorganized. Money drives them. Many of them have a financial incentive to do what they do. They either have it inherent in what they do, they buy things to steal and then turn them over to sell to someone else. They gain access into a network in order to sell that access. They buy data from someone else in order to capitalize on it, do analysis, and turn it into something that they can resell. Everything that you can think of clear-wise in the marketplace happens in the criminal marketplace at every level. So finance can drive someone, but it is not the only motivator. And you cannot look at an incident in isolation and necessarily go, yep, that was financially motivated. Very rarely can you just do that. There are some instances that are exceptions. Ransomware, for example, is a good exception. In most instances, I'd say 9 out of 10, ransomware is purely being driven by financial incentives. They're trying to make money, and you happen to be how they're doing it. You're their customer, if you will. But 1 out of 10 times, ransomware is done as a cleanup measure to cause havoc, or to lock down data to take out traces so that when this gets restored from backup or gets wiped to be reinstalled, the traces of something else they did is covered up. Sometimes this is done out of a motivation of unfairness, which is one of the bigger ones that I'll talk about in a second. Sometimes it's revenge, etc. Like an insider might release ransomware if they knew how. There's many other reasons why this could happen, but with ransomware, it's the minority. The majority of the time, ransomware is financial, and it's one of the easy ones. But outside of that, if I get in your network and I steal intellectual property, you can't necessarily say that incident was only driven by finance. It's more nuanced. You can't look at just the incident and even make that attribution at all. You have to attribute that kind of motivation to the attackers you've defined after looking at the full life cycle. What did they do before? What did they do after? Did they monetize this? Did it drive a secondary attack? Right? Look at the Hafnium activity. Hafnium being a Microsoft, again, part of the zoo and all that. Really, Hafnium is a very organized attacker who came in. They achieved a foothold in a third-party supported organization and then used it to bridge and jump into other organizations by taking advantage of this one capability. And not just them. SolarWinds, I realize I just mixed those up. SolarWinds is the one where they got into SolarWinds, a third party, and then got into succeeding departments. Because a lot of people use SolarWinds and they utilize that product in order to get a beachhead into other networks and bridge in. That's a very organized attacker. They had an objective in mind, which wasn't necessarily SolarWinds. They took potentially an opportunity, but they took the risk and accepted the risk of getting into SolarWinds and waiting to capitalize on that so they could use it to get into other targets. Again, very organized in their manner. A disorganized, opportunistic driven attacker would not succeed that way. Those are hallmarks of an organized attacker. With Hafnium, more appropriately, that deals with on-premises exchange, and that was someone taking advantage of a vulnerability that effectively was a 0-day until it was known, and then continued to take advantage of that to get into places. Again, organized, and not only by one. Even though most of the talk is about Hafnium, there were multiple actors involved in this. Some disorganized, some organized, who took advantage of it, especially after it was made known. In fact, I suspect, and it's purely suspicion on my part, but the analyst in me says there's a pattern that would support that particular actor originally made it very visible so that other people would pile on to kind of hide their activity, hide in the forest, right? If you're the one tree on a plane, it's kind of easy to see you. If you're the one tree in a forest of millions, then it's a little harder. And I very much suspect that that's one thing they did. Now I'm going to erase this so we can talk about and lay out the different motivations. So we talked about finance being one of them, money. And there are rules to determining this. So as I get into the attribution, we'll talk through the profiles, we'll talk about some of the processes and go through some practicals on each one of these and how you determine whether somebody's financially motivated or not. What are the parameters that you would look for? Another thing that is confused by people, but at least they apply it, is politics. Politics drives threat attackers. It is a motivation for them. Frequently, when you see the words nation state or APT, this is the reference they're trying to make, that these particular entities are being described as being driven by a political motivation. They don't have a financial incentive for their targeting necessarily. They don't necessarily have they don't necessarily have other motivations. People who utilize these terms are trying to say that politics is the chief driver because they're given orders and they follow orders. You know, you could easily say military, or you could say owned by an entity, whether it's the US or another entity like Russia or China or so on. Very common names that people throw out that could just as easily be Vietnam, Malaysia, Germany, UK, Australia. Everybody has a group or several groups that performs basically politically driven cyber criminal activity. If you looked at them outside of the country, you would go, yep, that's a cybercrime. Doesn't matter whose name's on there. So politics can drive that. Another one that's talked about lesser but is still important to note is religion. Just like politics can drive and be a motivator for an attacker. Now, most of the religious-based attribution I've seen to date is mostly focused on Middle Eastern entities, with a few here in the US and a few in Europe as well, where religion is a key part of what motivates them to do what they do. They're given a direction by God, if you will, from the religion to do some action or not. But not the norm by any means, even though people have described this one to be the norm. So 3 of our motivations there. Another one that is lesser talked about but is linked to both of these is this principle of unfairness. Can drive an attacker and be a motivation. You're like, what's unfairness? You might have a question mark. 3 question marks. You're like, what is unfairness? I don't know. So let me tell you, unfairness, the system or culture they live in does not allow them to have a full life. It does not allow them to have what we consider a balanced life or a full life. They're unfair in their application. Usually there are serious social and cultural divides. There's a caste system, or there's a serious divide between who's very wealthy and who's not. And it's so staggeringly bad that the fairness in the system does no longer support, if you will, the common person, and it will drive them to perform cybercrime. It could be that it's so bad that that's the only way they can survive. That will drive them to perform actions. A lot of your scam, fraud, and abuse actions are driven by unfairness more than anything else. Not that there isn't a financial incentive, absolutely. They're poor, if you will, or they're needy in many ways, which is probably a better way to talk about this. Their needs are so powerful, it overwhelms any other moral or ethical implication. And to survive, they will scam someone else, they will fraud someone else, or they will perform abuse to get what they need, because the system they live in is so unfair. And it doesn't matter the country, first world, third world, they all have someone or more than one someone that's driven by unfairness as a primary motivator, as a subsidiary motivator. Because just like people, organizations are not so simple that you can go, yep, they're financially motivated, and that's the only thing. It's much bigger than that. Typically, there's more than one. There are many others, but there usually is a primary driver of some kind, and you want to identify that. And again, in following board sessions and in slides presentations, I'll talk about some of the systems behind making these determinations. But let me get on to the other ones so we don't get out of too far down. I do try to keep these under 30 minutes. Another motivator, if you will, is power. Power, power, power. Now, power can be described and understood in a couple ways. And while I'm on it, I'm going to go ahead and write down influence because these are related but separate. That's a C, influence. Power is having power over someone else. So I may perform cybercrime, I may perform attacks, I may do what I do in the criminal industry because it gives me a sense of power. Typically, power over other people is what this is meant to be. Power and control can all be put under this label. Versus influence, I may do something because I want to influence an event, a person, or an activity. So if I want to steer a conversation in the world because something nefarious and bad is happening but is being given a shield of legitimacy, I may leak data to influence the narrative. I may do this at intense danger to myself, but I may influence data to out someone who looks otherwise benign so that there's a greater understanding of what's going on. I'm using an influence motivator to perform something we would consider a criminal action. Many leaks, for any reason, no matter what the type, it's not very legible, many leaks are driven by a need to influence a narrative or discussion or a person. And last but not least of our top ones here at least is poverty. Don't mistake poverty and money, financially driven, right, or unfairness driven between poverty. Poverty will drive you, again, just like unfairness, you are so poor, you're so in such a harsh condition for whatever reason, whether you got there by yourself through your own actions or just because of the system and culture you're in doesn't allow you to grow out of it, or you just have a poverty mindset and your whole family does and they drag you back into this, whatever reason, poverty can drive you to do things. And you can be rich materially and have a poverty mentality that can force this to happen. So you can see this also as a lack, if you will, of something that will drive them. Now you might be asking in your back of your brain, like, how in the world am I going to figure out poverty? Well, believe it or not, there are hallmarks, there are tool marks, and there are behaviors, there are fingerprints that can point to each one of these that you can use to measure. All of them are fuzzy. I said in the beginning, every bit of attribution is fuzzy. But just like any kind of behavioral science, it's just any kind of behavioral measurement, there are key indicators and characteristics you can look for every one of these. And when you see them, it becomes kind of an important thing that you can attribute, okay, we have high confidence that this person is driven by poverty with some desire for influence and maybe a financial incentive built into what they do. Now I'll tell you, in most cases, I'll leave these up, in most cases, you have to view as much of the life cycle as possible to make any kind of understanding of these stick. If all you see is incidents, all you see is the attack, and you never see the after effect of what they do with what they took or what they do with what that attack gave them, you can't measure most of this. You will only see what you want to see because you don't have a big enough picture. If you don't look at the planning, recon, build, and operate phase that led up to the attack, you cannot see enough to make this kind of attribution happen, to make sure you understand the motivation behind why they did something. And it is not static. I'll kind of end with this. No matter how we want to say, okay, yes, this is a financially incentive group, this is what they do, and we want to say that year after year after year because it's easier to maintain something once we establish it. Groups change just like people do, and their motivations may update. That's why this is in a cycle. It's part of the life cycle, if you will, of analysis, where you go through and you process intelligence and you're constantly checking it. That's another discussion we can have, but motivation key thing is once you see something, if you read a report from 2014 and then you read a report from 2021 and the group hasn't changed, even though you can see activity that has changed, maybe their industry has changed, maybe there's been a shift in how they do business, a shift in the composition of the group, they can change and probably have changed the motivation, and that needs to be re-examined. So I'll stop here for today. Again, this is part of a longer series on attribution and cybersecurity and threat intelligence world. These are some of the top 7 motivations that drive organized and disorganized attackers to do what they do, and key factors that influence these are risk and opportunity. Poverty, for example, they may attack one target because there's an opportunity to do so more than anything else, and they tend to fall in the disorganized bucket. Influence tends to be more organized. Power can be across the board, either one. Unfairness, more disorganized typically, though they can actually be driven to be organized, but most of your attackers will fall into the unorganized side. Religion and politics vary. Politics tends to be more organized than disorganized, though you have both. You have people that will hack for the nation, or they're considered patriots if they attack someone that's an enemy, politically defined enemy. Same thing for religion. So it kind of can vary a lot. And finances across the board, though successful long-term groups that dabble in monetarily driven enterprises tend to be organized over disorganized, just because success carries. Like with marketing, you have to have something sustained or else you just don't survive over time. All right, thank you for your time. I appreciate you joining me on this whiteboard discussion on threat actors and their motivations. If you like what you heard, please press like. If you like the information you see and you're enjoying this channel, please subscribe to our channel so you can get future updates. Thank you.